Brilliant, defiant, unstoppable. They laughed at the quiet woman in the back, but seconds later, she shattered every doubt in the room. Dear story lovers, welcome back. Thank you so much for standing by and waiting patiently during our little break. I truly appreciate your support and loyalty. Today's story is worth the wait. It's powerful, emotional, and full of unexpected turns. Let's dive right in. The University of Michigan looked like a painting that morning. The sun peeked through heavy clouds, spilling golden light onto the grand old brick buildings. Inside one of its oldest lecture halls, the air was cold and brisk, but the room buzzed with life. Students in neat sweaters and bright jackets clustered at the long, polished wooden desks, their laptops open, their faces shining with the eagerness of youth. Overhead, the fluorescent lights gave a soft, constant hum, blending with the low murmurs of conversation. Among them, at the very back of the room, sat Candace Rubin. She pulled her simple cardigan tighter around her shoulders and adjusted her glasses, her notebook resting neatly on her desk. She was different from the others, older by at least a decade, quieter and far less polished. While the other students whispered and laughed, Candace sat in calm stillness, her pen poised, her sharp eyes taking in everything. Despite her calm appearance, a small knot of nerves tightened inside her chest. She knew what they said about her. The old lady in the back, the one who didn't belong. Candace had heard the whispers, the sideways glances, the occasional stifled giggles. It didn't matter. She was here for herself, not for them. Years ago, life had pulled her away from her dreams, but now she had fought her way back to them. She wasn't going to let a few glances break her spirit. At the front of the room stood Professor James Whitlock, the man everyone respected but secretly feared. His silver hair was neatly combed, his jacket perfectly pressed, and his posture stiff with authority. His reputation for brilliance was rivaled only by his sharp tongue. He had no patience for mistakes, and no mercy for those who stumbled. Today, he was talking about a particularly brutal calculus problem, something deep, complex, and difficult even for the brightest students in the room. His voice echoed through the lecture hall, smooth and commanding. As he scrawled the problem onto the massive chalkboard, the students leaned forward in their seats, exchanging uneasy looks. Even the most confident among them hesitated, their eyes darting nervously across the complicated string of symbols and numbers. Then came the moment that shifted the room. Professor Whitlock capped the chalk with a loud snap and turned to scan the rows of students, his sharp gaze flicking from one nervous face to another. Then, with a slight smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth, he stopped. "Miss Rubin," he said, his voice slicing through the room like a cold wind, "why don't you show us what you've learned?" The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then a ripple of giggles, soft but unmistakable, moved through the classroom. A few students whispered behind their hands. Candace felt their eyes all land on her, sharp as needles. Her heart gave a small, startled jump. She could feel the blood rush to her face, warming her cheeks. Candace's hands trembled slightly as she pushed back her chair. She rose to her feet, every movement feeling magnified. The distance from her desk to the chalkboard stretched endlessly before her, like a road she wasn't sure she could walk. Her legs felt wooden. The whispers buzzed louder in her ears. She clutched her notebook tightly to her chest, willing herself to stay steady. Every step toward the front felt heavier than the last. Her breath came faster, and her mind raced with 1,000 fears. She could hear a boy in the second row whisper something that made the girls around him laugh. Candace swallowed hard, kept her eyes on the chalkboard, and kept walking. All eyes were on her. The classroom seemed to shrink around Candace as she reached the chalkboard. The air had grown colder, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed louder than before, casting a harsh white glare over everything. The complicated equation stretched across the board like a cruel joke, daring her to try. Candace gripped the piece of chalk so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind, usually so calm and organized, now felt like a storm, Doubts screamed at her from every corner of her brain. She could almost hear them in the snickers behind her, the cruel, low whispers slicing through the silence. "She's going to mess it up," someone muttered. Another chuckle followed, sharp and cutting. Candace's heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Her face flushed hot, and her mouth felt dry. She stared at the equation, its loops, its symbols, its hidden traps, and for a terrible moment, her mind went blank. She could feel Professor Whitlock's gaze burning into her back, cold and expectant, waiting for her to crumble. A wave of panic rose in her chest. She wasn't young like them. She wasn't fast, or shiny, or fearless. What was she thinking, coming back to school after so many years? What if they were right about her? What if she truly didn't belong? Candace squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it all out. In that darkness, a memory surfaced, small but strong. She was 7 years old again, sitting at the rickety kitchen table of their old apartment. A math book, borrowed from the library, lay open in front of her. She remembered her mother's soft hand brushing her messy hair aside, the smell of coffee and cinnamon lingering in the air. "You were born for this, Candy," her mother had whispered, kissing the top of her head. "You've got a mind the world will never see coming. Don't you ever doubt it." The memory hit her like a wave of warmth. Candace opened her eyes. The classroom blurred into the background. The whispers faded. She could still feel the fear, yes, but now it was burning alongside something stronger, something deeper. "I will not be mocked," she thought. "I will not hide." Her hand moved to the board. At first, the strokes were shaky. The chalk squeaked awkwardly against the surface. A few more giggles rippled through the room. Professor Whitlock leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, a smug, satisfied look pulling at his mouth. Candace didn't stop. She forced herself to focus, tuning out the noise, the stares, the doubt. She traced out the first steps carefully, each number and letter a whisper of her younger self, the one who had dreamed so fiercely. The solution didn't reveal itself all at once. It was like groping through a fog. She paused, her hand hovering in the air. The room seemed to lean in closer, every breath, every heartbeat, heavy in the silence. Candace could feel the pressure pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Professor Whitlock tapped his finger against his arm impatiently. Somewhere near the back, someone coughed pointedly, making a few students stifle their laughs. Still, Candace stayed. Her hand returned to the board, a little steadier now. She moved slowly, step by step, her mind beginning to click back into place. Familiar patterns started to emerge, like stars peeking through a cloudy night. The tension in the room thickened until it was almost unbearable. Would she pull it off, or would fear take over? The chalk squeaked loudly as Candace's hand moved faster across the board. At first, the rhythm was cautious, uncertain. But then, something shifted, subtle at first, like a breeze before a storm. Her shoulders relaxed. Her movements became fluid. She wasn't forcing it anymore. She was flowing. Her mind clicked into a space she hadn't touched in years. The quiet, electric place where numbers weren't obstacles. They were music. They danced in patterns only she could see. With every confident line she drew, the complicated equation that had seemed like a mountain started to crumble under her fingers. The whispers behind her faded to nothing. The classroom, so full of buzzing noise before, was now so silent that Candace could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Even the students who had mocked her froze in their seats, their eyes wide, their notebooks forgotten. Professor Whitlock, who had been leaning lazily against his desk, straightened up. At first, a frown creased his forehead. Maybe he thought she had made a mistake. Maybe he still believed he was about to humiliate her. But the frown didn't deepen. It twisted into something else entirely. Confusion, then shock. Candace worked without hesitation now. She wasn't just solving the equation. She was weaving it, simplifying the steps in a way so elegant, so natural, it didn't even look hard. Lines that most students would have slogged through with pages of work, she reduced with a few clean strokes of chalk. It was the kind of beauty in mathematics that only true masters ever showed, effortless brilliance. Professor Whitlock stepped forward without realizing it, drawn closer by the force of what he was seeing. His arms dropped from his chest. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Candace's final stroke came with a soft click as the chalk tapped against the board. The answer stared back at the room, bright and undeniable. Every part of the solution laid out with precision and clarity. Candace lowered the chalk slowly, letting her hand fall to her side. She didn't rush. She didn't fidget. She turned around, facing the sea of stunned faces. Not a single whisper remained. Students who minutes ago had laughed behind their hands now sat frozen, staring at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. Some had their mouths hanging open slightly. Others blinked as if trying to figure out if they were dreaming. Professor Whitlock looked like a man who had just been hit by a thunderbolt. His face flushed a deep red, his eyebrows lifted high, and his body rigid as he struggled to reconcile what he had just witnessed. He was a man who had spent decades judging talent, praising brilliance, and yet here stood someone he had almost thrown away without a second thought. Candace stood tall, her chest rising and falling steadily. Her heart still pounded, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the fierce, wild joy of being seen, truly seen, not for her age, or her quietness, or her simple clothes, but for the mind she had carried all along. She met the professor's wide, shocked eyes, and for the first time that day, Candace smiled, small, calm, and unshakable. The room stayed frozen as if time itself had paused to honor what had just happened. She had done it. She had shown them all. The lecture hall, once thick with judgment and silent mockery, now pulsed with something entirely different. Admiration. It floated through the air like a new perfume, sweet and clear. Students who had barely noticed Candace before now leaned forward in their seats, clapping slowly at first, unsure if they were allowed to break the silence that had gripped them. One brave student clapped louder, then another. And suddenly, the entire room was on its feet, the sound of applause growing louder and louder until it echoed off the grand old walls. Candace stood frozen at the front, the chalk dust still clinging to her fingers, her chest rising and falling in quiet disbelief. She had come here just to prove something to herself. But now she had proven something to everyone. Professor James moved toward her. There was no smirk now, no smugness, only a deep, almost awkward respect shining in his eyes. He stopped a few feet from her, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the chalkboard. For a moment, it seemed he was struggling for the right words. "Miss Rubin," he said, his voice softer than it had been all semester, "I owe you an apology." He paused, clearing his throat as the students watched in amazement. "And perhaps an invitation. I would be honored if you would consider working alongside me next term." Candace felt her heart catch in her throat. An invitation to work with him, to teach, to help shape the minds she had once thought were so far above her. She looked around at the faces of the students, so full of something she hadn't seen there before. Respect. Hope. She smiled, small but real. "I would be honored, Professor." From that day forward, everything changed. Candace didn't just finish the semester. She finished at the top of her class, earning a distinction that she wore like a hidden crown. Students who once overlooked her now came to her with questions, asking for help, eager to learn from the woman who had shown them what true strength looked like. And Professor James, he became her greatest supporter, often citing Candace's work as examples of true mathematical beauty. He became not just her professor, but her mentor, proud to have her by his side. Candace's quiet courage inspired others, too, especially the women in the department who had wondered if they were too late, if their dreams had an expiration date. Candace showed them that brilliance had no timeline, and courage needed no permission. Months later, when Candace walked across the stage, her diploma in her hand, the spring air soft and warm around her, she felt lighter than she ever had before. The trees around the university bloomed, their blossoms falling like snow. The sun kissed her cheeks as she walked forward, no longer hiding. Candace Rubin was no longer just the quiet woman in the back of the room. She was a scholar, a mentor, a voice that could no longer be ignored. And as she looked toward the future, her heart whispered the truth she now carried with her always. It's never too late to show the world who you really are. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, subscribe for more inspiring tales, and share it with someone who loves a good story too. I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. See you in the next video soonest.